Hello and welcome to Evaluate's webinar, The $1 Billion Question, our paper perspective part of your strategy. I'm Lisa Urquhart, editor of Evaluate Vantage, Evaluate's editorial arm, and joining me today are Rita Yamujala, Director of Solution Engineering at MMIT. She has a Master's of Business and Science in Biotechnology and Genomics and has a decade of experience in the US healthcare market. Also with me is Sean Crowley, Director of New Business Development at Evaluate, where he partners with life science executives to help address challenges across the drug development and commercialization lifecycle. Before we kick things off, I'd like to go through a couple of housekeeping rules. The webinar should last for around 30 minutes, and it is being recorded, and we will share a link to recording following the webinar. Please do ask questions as we go through the session via the Ask a Question section towards the bottom of your screen. Any questions we aren't able to answer today, we'll follow up with a little later. So to get going, to start, Ritu and Sean, we've seen a number of disappointing launches over the years, including Lilly's cancer drug, Lartruvo and Bluebird's Zynteglo, just to name a few. And arguably, some of these have been down to the companies failing to appreciate the difficulties of reimbursement. And while I think we all know the importance of clinical endpoints when it comes to trials, but very much on the topic of today, should companies also be thinking about these in terms of payer reimbursement? And if so, why have companies traditionally failed to think about this until it's almost too late?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really very important, and it's a topic very close to heart because we've been in the industry for so long. It's very difficult to see drugs that don't perform as expected during launches. And I think it's very important to consider payer perspectives at every stage in pipeline development. And we've seen a lot of instances where if that's not really done to the extent that it should be done, it oftentimes results in situations where the manufacturer encounters a scenario that they were not prepared for. So it's not to say that every time you consult with a payer, you get their perspectives and you include them in your strategy, that every time whatever they say is going to be feasible to account into your strategy. That's not always the case. But I think it's still important to consider and take into account how payers are looking at different therapeutic areas, how they are currently managing it, what are some of the standard utilization management tools they implement within an indication. Are they looking at a certain new mechanism of action or a new route of administration as something that they would have to pay more closer attention to? And what that will help organizations do essentially is to proactively plan for that, resource for it, set realistic expectations with leadership within the company. And if you're a smaller biotech that's seeking investment, for example, and I know Sean has encountered a lot of has been in touch with a lot of such companies over the years. So when you're putting your due diligence package together, you're putting your investor presentations together, this can all really show how informed your strategy is and how you're considering all aspects of what that strategy should be.
Okay. So it seems to be one of those things where I suppose big pharma tend to be a little bit better at this than perhaps small biotechs that you mentioned, Ritu. Sean, have you got any sort of perspectives around why there is that difference?
Sure, thanks, Lisa. And I would echo a lot of what Ritu said there. So within big pharma, there's large groups that are responsible, large commercial teams responsible for ensuring market access, and they're thinking about coverage every step of the way throughout clinical development. Within biotechs, you see much leaner teams. So this is a hat that someone's wearing. It's not their full-time responsibility. And so as Ritu said, these conversations are happening, and oftentimes they're happening early in the process, and then it's not something that gets revisited on a regular basis. And really what we're seeing now is more companies revisiting or needing to revisit market access at every stage gate. So determining whether or not they're going to fund a program and move to phase 3 when they're selecting as early as indication selection, but then later on as they're moving their products through the clinic and working more on that portfolio optimization piece. And so for years, I've been with Evaluate for about 10 years. This was something that was talked about, but maybe less often done. And we're seeing it becoming more center stage for these biotech companies. And I think a lot of it, Lisa, what's driving it is the VCs that are backing these companies. They want to ensure that there is a plan for access and to get access in order to justify some of the valuations that we've seen over the past several years.
I certainly know the conversations I tend to have with VCs. That's one of the first things they think about, how you're going to get this drug to market. And that's very much part of the investment plan.
Yeah, so, and I would add to that. And I would just add to that to say that, at every stage of the pipeline development, not all companies need the same level of payer perspectives. Right? When you're in an early phase, you're still trying to figure out what your TPP is, what your clinical endpoints would likely look like, what your value proposition is. You're still formulating that story. At that phase, it's really good to get a baseline understanding of what an indication's, current dynamics look like. So it can be really high level summary of what a very high level understanding of what coverage looks like across the market basket. It can be, a quick pulse study to check, if the clinical endpoints you're selecting actually match up with what payers generally look for in a value story for an agent. As you go to phase 2 and you have a more clearer TPP in place, or you're heading towards phase 2B, then you can start testing your TPP and seeing how payers are reacting to your target product profile. As you get closer to launch, then you can create a more detailed forecasting plan. So it's not to say that, biotech companies have to invest the same amount of resources and finances into using payer perspectives in their strategy that a commercial team that's in phase 3 and preparing for launch would. It's a different level of investment, but it's still a very helpful strategic investment, even when you don't have a commercial team built out, that you can really truly invest in, because it's high level insights.
I mean, often we hear from companies the fact that while they really want to do these, sometimes if they're small biotechs, they don't have the resourcing. I mean, is there anything that they can be doing, I suppose, at the various gate points to make sure that they are going to eventually be sort of get reimbursement, or it's not going to come as a surprise at the end?
Yeah, I think as Ritu said, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and that tends to be an objection that we will at times need to overcome, where folks will say, we're early, we don't need to think about that just yet, and really helping them understand the different ways, as Ritu said, we can provide those types of insights, and they can incorporate those insights into their drug development plans to ensure they have the right endpoints, to ensure they're getting the right data, so that when it comes time further down the line to make the investment in pushing that program forward and maybe a larger scale investment around payer perspectives, they have the underlying data to feel confident, and they're not just going in blind for the first time.
Okay, so it's a more sort of a data play, that actually keep an eye on the industry by using data.
Exactly.
Sorry, Ritu.
Oh yeah, exactly. And I'm just echoing what Sean just said, right? Like if you're thinking about clinical endpoints, for example, if you're thinking about phase 1, phase 2 clinical endpoint selection, if you're thinking of oncology, for example, oftentimes PFS, the progression-free survival, is the go-to endpoint that manufacturers target. But you'll be surprised how often, when payers are conducting the cost to value analysis, they'll fall back on overall survival because that's more of a value proposition to them. So how do you manage those expectations when you're talking about progression-free survival versus overall survival, right? Even if you don't have good numbers for overall survival, but you have good numbers for progression-free survival, how do you message that appropriately and plan to message that in the best possible manner during launch to payers? Getting that perspective early on from payers is what will help you do that better.
So by the time it is about sort of having that relationship very early on in the process, and then maintaining that relationship throughout the development cycle.
Exactly.
So, I mean, do you have any examples? Let's say, companies that have done well on this, or perhaps you might have an alternative example where companies have done very badly on this, in terms of maintaining those relationships.
Yeah,
Ritu, would you like to?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think so. It's we have seen very public examples of where it's not to say that companies didn't do a good job at it. I think that's a very strong statement to make, but rather where, better considerations could have been in play had payer perspectives been weighed more heavily in those strategic decisions. So, for example, Prolvent and Repatha, I mean, is a public is of knowledge, right, to everyone, of how the pricing could have been better. And I think like it had such good efficacy. There was a good value story for both agents. But when you think about from the payer perspective, the cost implications of the drugs, just because of the sheer volume of patients that could use the potential drug, I think like that's where like the whole price war started. So Prolvent and Repatha are a good example. I think like instances where companies have done well, I would say like, some of the new biomarkers within oncology, for example, one of they are showing really great promise. If you think of ret targeting agents or MET targeting agents, I think those are showing a lot of promise. But when you think of payer perspectives, one of the key things that we hear from payers often, we conduct a lot of MMIT conducts a lot of syndicated research where we try to understand how payers are discussing about these new agents with account managers from manufacturer organizations. And in those conversations, we get to know that one of the major concerns that payers have is that physicians are potentially not when testing for these biomarkers because they're so new. So, what is the manufacturer's strategy to educate physicians to test for those biomarkers so that even if the payer is covering the drug, the patient actually gets access to the drug? So those are like, the kinds of considerations that should be that manufacturers should be thinking early on. And I think they have, like these manufacturers with RET and MET agents, I think have done a good job in thinking about that and promoting education for those biomarkers.
Sean, do you have anything to add on this one?
So one that sticks out in my mind, and at Evaluate, we work with a lot of BD&L, business development and licensing folks, as well as strategy teams. And so kind of come at more from that angle. But there was a well-publicized acquisition back in 2015 or 2016 by Valiant, who was doing a lot of M&A at the time. And they acquired a company called Sprout Pharmaceuticals, which had a drug they were developing called Addie, which was, I think hypoactive sexual desire disorder, I believe, for a female, hypoactive sexual desire disorder. And it was a $1 billion acquisition. They acquired the company for that access to that drug, and the launch just did not go as planned. And so I believe they ended up actually selling.
Disastrous, wasn't it? Rather than didn't go well. I mean, that is a bit of an understatement.
And I mean, I think there were a number of publicized issues at the time, Lisa, about the drug and the launch. Access probably, I think, played a part in coverage. But the peak sales that justified the acquisition, I remember being in the hundreds of $1 million range, and the actual peak sales of the drug were closer to 15 to 20 million. And Valiant actually ended up selling the drug back to a group of Sprout shareholders for kind of pennies on the dollar and a royalty later. So, I mean, all that goes to say, one, access needs to be included as part of the diligence strategy as well with these acquisitions. And we're certainly seeing a lot of that with the stakeholders that we support here at Evaluate, where it's not just speaking to KOLs and clinicians and regulators, but also on the payer side as well.
Okay. I think also with the thing with Sprout as well. I mean, they might have wanted to perhaps talk to some of the end users on that one. If I remember rightly, it was something like you had an extra half an extra sexually satisfying experience per month, which I'm not entirely sure how you measure that. But and also, I don't think you could drink with it. So yeah, I mean, maybe not only just doing the due diligence around reimbursement, but maybe talking to some of the end users might have been a good one with that one. So I mean, one area where we do seem to have quite good reimbursement, and although that is slightly changing, is rare diseases. I mean, is that something you'd like to comment on, Ritu? They seem to have, it almost seems as if most of them have got it right in terms of actually getting payers to reimburse some of these higher price drugs.
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah. So for payers, it's really hard to put any kind of restrictions on rare diseases when it's the only treatment in most instances it's either the first or the second treatment in an indication, and it's the only hope that a patient has. So you really can't, unless it's priced really out there. I think like it's really hard for payers, IDNs, and PBMs to enforce any kind of coverage, restrictions on it.
Yeah.
But well, while they'll cover the drug, like oftentimes you'll see most of these rare disease drugs get coverage. It's also the quality of coverage that a manufacturer would need to focus on. So, for example, within DMD is a great example where, oftentimes we're seeing in policies that the reauthorization durations, your initial authorization duration is in the 3 to 6 month time frame. And in order to get a reauthorization, the physician has to actually submit proof of improvement on the therapy that the patient is on. And that can very well even mean like the number of steps that a patient was able to walk from in comparison to what they were able to before. So that's like, a significant restriction where, if a physician is not able to prove that, then how does a patient get continued access to a therapy? So those kinds of restrictions, I think we are starting to see a lot more of in the rare disease indication. So while coverage per se is not a concern, you will likely get covered, but the quality of coverage is something that, you need to keep an eye out for.
I mean, that's very interesting. That really does play into the whole world of real world evidence. I mean, is that important because these drugs are so expensive? I know it's a very tricky one if you are a patient with those, but are we likely to see more and more and more of that, given the fact that some of these drugs, particularly gene therapies, are now hitting the $1 million mark, well, over $1 million mark?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think like you're going to see as more expensive therapies, the one-shot treatment and cure kind of therapies come to market, you're likely to see a lot more value-based contracts play into, contracting strategies instead of the traditional rebate strategies that manufacturers have used. So outcomes-based contracts, value-based contracts, I think are going to play a significant role. And I think like we've already started seeing it to a certain extent. When you think of agents like Luxturna, you think of existing gene therapies in the market. And if you even think of like, rare disease therapies like Galafold, for example, and Fabry disease was the second agent that came into the indication. But we still saw like in the first 3 to 6 months, we saw, a certain number of lives that were not covered even for Galafold, although it was an oral therapy in Fabry disease. So I think like there's still, that initial launch period of 6 to 12 months post-launch, I think payers are still playing it by ear, trying to see where physicians are demanding it. And then, still you'll get coverage eventually. But quality of coverage is one piece to keep in mind. And the second piece is, to have that payer perspective of how likely are they to engage in value-based or outcomes-based contracts for these expensive therapies.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the examples I mentioned at the beginning was Bluebird Bio's drug for, I think it was, beta thalassemia. And I think they actually, in the end, I know it's very different in the US, but I think in the end, they decided to stop selling the drug in, I think, Europe, because I think they were having issues with, I think there was very much a demand that it showed benefits. I think they actually tried to sort of spread the cost of the drug over 5 years. With each year, they would then actually assess the progress that patients had made and then pay. And if they didn't make any progress, I think they had to reimburse them. So, and I think Bluebird found that a little bit too tough. So I think they stopped development in Europe. I don't think we've seen anything like that in the US, but it's very interesting that there is this idea, particularly in the US, where we've traditionally seen a lot of access, that people are reining it in. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that, Sean?
So maybe not exactly answering the question, but kind of following along the same theme around rare and orphan diseases. So when we're speaking with biotechs developing those treatments for an orphan or a rare disease, they often are thinking, so access is top of mind because they're thinking we're going to take this all the way to market ourselves because it's a small patient population. They can have a small commercial team, a small sales force. And so it is something that they are leading with, which is great to see because at the end of the day, they're supporting a patient community that doesn't have any options. And so it's critical not only that they get those patients in clinical trials. They demonstrate the safety as well as efficacy. But once that drug gets approved, they're able to get it in the hands of as many folks as possible, because there are really no other options. So again, for those companies, they're oftentimes thinking about it so that they can move with pace, which is really great for the communities they serve.
So staying on the subject of rare diseases, and particularly some of the pushback against, or what we're starting to see some of the pushback around the pricing. I mean, one area where we've definitely seen growth in the sector is companies finding rare disease indications for larger products. I know that happens around a lot of the cancer indications, or rare disease companies increasing the number of rare indications for their products. I mean, prime example is AstraZeneca's long-lasting follow-up to Solaris, Ultomiris. So given that this is becoming an increasing strategy for companies, how do companies then prioritize or identify new indications, but also kind of sort of stay on the side of payers? I suppose that talks about prioritization. I mean, I don't know which one of you wants to go first in answering it.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I think, that's a really good question, right? When you have the strategy of expanding an existing agent's indications, which ones do you prioritize within rare indications and within non-rare indications as well? So I think there are multiple factors that companies generally take into account. And we know this because we do a lot of consulting work that kind of ties in, evaluates data across different indications, and then market access data from MMIT as well. So a lot of biotech companies and larger companies work with us on such approaches. But oftentimes what these companies look at is, the baseline understanding of what the indication management looks like, whether it's a rare indication or a non-rare indication, the unmet therapeutic need. Epi is another, epidemiology is definitely another factor that they consider. What's the target population? What's the return on investment within that particular indication? And then the current standard of care, like how do they compare up against the current standard of care? And the overall cost of care within an indication, right? So it's not just, what the product's price would be. So price sensitivity analysis is oftentimes something that every company will do when they're trying to think about, what to introduce an agent at within a particular indication. But it's also like the total cost of care. What's the net cost that they can expect once their product comes to the market? So a lot of these different factors, I think you need to kind of triangulate data from all of these different factors to kind of predict which indication makes most sense and will yield the best return on investment when you're investing and expanding into those different indications. So it's not just one factor. I think it's multiple factors that play into that decision.
Sean, I mean, what can you add anything about Evaluate and prioritization and how it can help?
Sure. And then just to kind of layer in some of the Evaluate inputs that we often see biopharma companies utilizing as part of this process. So certainly it's great to understand the current standard of care, but who else is approaching that indication? So what's the pipeline look like? What's the competitive intensity? What are other new mechanisms that might be, or modalities that might be in development that you want to look out for? And where are they at in the clinic? Because certainly when it comes to funding right now, we all know what the situation is like with the public markets, and certainly the private markets even getting a little bit tight. But folks want to be able to tell that story to investors that they're speaking with, not only that they have something that's differentiated, that's clearly differentiated, and there's a plan, but also that they have a leg up, or they're really going to offer an ROI to the investor who cuts the check for that round, or contributes to the company's funding.
Yeah, and I just to add to that, Sean, I think that's a great point. I think like competitive intelligence is definitely something that you'll oftentimes see clients engage in when they're trying to prioritize a particular indication. And the way, generally we consult with clients, when we provide this consulting with clients, we'll show what the forecast looks like for those competing agents, but then also what does access look like? What are payer perspectives currently? What are the different utilization management tools they are implementing for certain MOAs, mechanisms of action, or route of administration within the market basket? pharmacy versus medical benefit. We'll provide that kind of analysis at a high level. And then also tap into payer and PBM perspectives to understand how are they likely to manage it in the future if a new mechanism of action comes into that particular indication or a new route of administration comes in. And you'll be surprised how differently payers react to the introduction of a new mechanism of action or a new route of administration based on the TPP of a drug and based on the existing agents within an indication. So it's very different the way they look at rare diseases versus immunology versus oncology. So I think and even within those larger sub disease types, you'll see that within specific disease states as well, there's a very different perspective that payers hold. So I think accounting for that payer perspective also really helps and fluidly maps through when you're thinking of which indication to expand into when you use evaluate data with MMIT data in that sense.
I mean, that's very interesting, Ruta. Can I just pick that up? You mentioned a lot. You mentioned about mechanisms of action and new routes of administration. I mean, if they're new, how do you engage with payers and think about reimbursement? Because there is no sort of historic reference points.
Yeah, and that's a great question. So oftentimes the way we approach that is to look at analogs. So we'll look at analogs that had, a new route of administration that entered into a similar indication with a similar market basket, like the number of agents that were in the market basket. So oftentimes, for example, if you're coming in with an IV agent that's entering into a genericized oral market basket, we'll have analogs for that where similar agents entered into similar indications. So we'll be able to triangulate information from that. You'll also be able to find analogs that were launched by smaller companies versus larger companies at a different price point, based on what their scenarios were. So analog analysis really helps identify, how payers will react in those situations and how the market reacted in return to those access restrictions across different indications. So that's analog analysis, I think, is one way that I know, and I think Sean can speak more about it, but I know even Evaluate uses this approach a lot.
Absolutely, and happy to kind of talk a little bit further and carry on the conversation, Lisa, because I think, as Ritu said, analogs are quite valuable, not just when it comes to understanding access, but when it comes to uptake. Again, that goes hand in hand. So looking at the sales alongside access and overlaying those two data sets is something that now, with the capabilities we have across our combined organizations, we're able to do, and that can really help these manufacturers understand what went on in these prior situations and really help better prepare them to go out and have the right conversations and make sure they're securing the right coverage with payers that they're working with. And that's certainly just one example of an analog-based approach that we use within Evaluate and within MMIT. But there's a whole host of additional types of data sets, both on the clinical side as well, that we can then provide to our customers to help give them the full picture as part of the planning process.
Okay. I mean, obviously, new mechanisms of action. I mean, are there a sort of, can you be at a disadvantage? I know we've talked about the payers, or is it about the fact that we need more innovation and it's always welcome, no matter what perhaps potential difficulties that you have, perhaps around reimbursement and not knowing and having to use analogs? So I don't know, Ritu, do you think it's just it's a problem that can be surmounted and the industry does need innovation? So I'm just wondering about the companies out there that may be worrying if they've got a new method of action, how it might impact further down the line.
Yeah, most definitely. I think the entire industry welcomes innovation, right? Everybody wants, at the end of the day, I feel like all stakeholders want patients to have access to the best therapies. But it's also all stakeholders are thinking about how to best secure their position in the entire chain. So I think even we oftentimes we capture, as I'd mentioned before, we capture conversations between payers and manufacturers. And within the US market, especially, you hear of oftentimes payers appreciate new mechanisms of action, and they'll say that, oh yes, this is absolutely something that patients need right now. All they need in addition to that to absolutely make sure that the patient gets access to the therapy is a clear value proposition that they can then take to their P&T decision making committee and then highlight that to say that this is the cost to value benefit, and then secure their position in that conversation to make sure that their organization is secure while providing coverage to that new mechanism of action. So I think that oftentimes, manufacturers are excited about a new mechanism of action that they are bringing to market or a new route of administration, and validly so, right? They should be. But it's also the reality of how the market works, right? I think is another consideration that oftentimes, even if you don't have resources to understand it, even investing a nominal amount in it upfront can help you secure your value story with these stakeholders later on in the pipeline.
I mean, one of the things you've mentioned around this is the idea of the target product profile. If people aren't as familiar with that, can you explain a little bit more about it, and how early involvement with payers and PBMs can help with product profiles?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I see Sean came off mute. Sean, I'll let you go first.
Sure. Thanks, Ritu. And Lisa, that's a great question. And certainly it's a target product profiles, TPPs, as they're well known across industry, something that we've been working with clients that evaluate for a number of years to help them sort of flesh out. So very early on, helping them to define what that product should look like, what the identifiable patient population is, the pricing for that product, the clinical endpoints. So really the building blocks that are then going to inform the clinical development plan, as well as the ultimate go-to-market commercialization strategy for the drug. And we have the building blocks that go into that, or the foundation, I should say, throughout Evaluate syndicated data, MMIT syndicated data, but also within our capabilities to provide custom market research. So speaking with, as Ritu talked earlier, speaking with payers to helping define what the current landscape looks like and how this product would need to be differentiated, speaking with clinicians as well as regulators to help understand what the endpoints they would need to see in order to receive regulatory approval. So it's something that is critical, it's crucial, and it is not a one-time exercise. It's something that gets revisited throughout the clinical development process and iterated on as the drugs move forward. And again, that's where we kind of talked a little bit about it earlier with this whole approach to understanding payer sentiment and payer perspectives as part of drug development. You don't have to start with the big market research study. As the products will move through development, the information needs increase over time. And so it's certainly something that gets revisited at each stage gate when they move from, for instance, phase 1 into phase 2 and then phase 2B, as Ritu talked about earlier. Ritu, I'm sure there's a couple things you probably want to add in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well. And I think you covered it really well, Sean. And I think like the only piece I would add over there is when you're thinking of TPP, oftentimes the way our clients approach it is they'll not just look at their agent's TPP, but they'll compare it with competition or potential competitors' TPP. And when they try to survey payers, like either through an in-depth interview, like we have a robust panel of active P&T decision makers. So oftentimes clients will either tap into them through an in-depth interview, or it will be like, through a quick 5-day turnaround rapid response survey. But oftentimes the way it's structured essentially is that you provide the TPP of your agent versus competition and provide different management scenarios and price ranges as well. So you could say that for this particular price range, how are you likely to manage my agent based on my TPP versus my competitor's TPP? If it changes, if the price range changes to this extent or the TPP values change to this format, then how does that utilization management scenario shift? So what resonates the most through different scenarios? And, we work with our clients to develop those scenarios through Evaluate Consulting. We have a group of experts who can really, shape those scenarios in different formats. But it really helps you understand how payers' perspectives shift based on different TPP scenarios and different utilization management scenarios. So I think like that's another way by which clients oftentimes try to narrow in on a really good TPP that would resonate with the market.
Okay. So I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm the only kind of sort of like the only Brit in the conversation here. So, and a lot of the conversation has been around the US. So some of these ideas about, pricing hypotheses and payer access and reimbursement have very much been geared towards the US. I mean, how do you think how do these kind of discussions play out in other regions of the world?
Yeah, it's certainly, I mean, it's a great observation there, Lisa. And so my colleagues who work with customers in EMEA are having these very same conversations. And it's just, as you know, the groups that they're speaking with at the end of it, in terms of the payers, it's going to be slightly different due to how the healthcare systems operate in Europe as well as in other parts of the world, APAC. So they're still having the conversations. And it's something that at Evaluate and at MMIT, we can certainly support and have supported through some of the relationships that we have to then go out and survey folks in each of those countries. But maybe the output is slightly different, but the underlying data that goes into telling the story and creating that value story really is, I think, Ritu, pretty consistent across markets.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think like endpoint selection, clinical endpoint selection, getting perspective of key opinion leaders, whether that's physicians in a particular region versus payers of different types in different marketplaces. It really depends based on the region that you're focusing in on. But we conduct like key opinion leader discussions in China, in Japan, in Europe. We have a lot of stakeholders that we engage with. But the baseline need to speak about, to develop a TPP and to speak about access is pretty much the same across all regions in terms of, like to Sean's point, the data needs. So clinical endpoint determination, TPP development, pricing sensitivity analysis, all of those needs of research are essentially the same. Another piece that I would add to it is that oftentimes you have, products that are being developed ex-US, but eventually, as the companies want to expand the product's reach, they'll try to introduce that agent into the US market. And the way they tend to do that is usually through partnerships with companies that are already established in the US. So in those instances, when ex-US companies are trying to develop their presentations to their potential partners, having this information of how a payer may react within the US market is where we try to add in that US payer perspective as well for ex-US customers. So we call it the US market entry package, where we basically structure what that partnership presentation could potentially look like, so that it's clear that the company has done their due diligence when they're presenting to partners and they're presenting a clear value proposition.
Yes, that sounds very useful. So I'm just looking up, we're getting towards the end. Well, I think. So we've got a couple of questions that come in from the audience. So this is also, I think, a really great question. What advice would you give a small company entering the US market for the first time? So Rita, you slightly touched on that in the last question, but do you want to add to that? Or Sean, would you like to take this one? I'll start off with.
Sure. I mean, Ritu sort of touched on it there in some of the ways that we work with these companies through the US market entry package. But what I would say is it doesn't have to be all at once. So there's different points in time where you might need information to support some of these conversations. So while we can certainly provide a full scale consulting package to help folks understand and inform those conversations they're having with potential partners in the US, they'll probably want to think about it and do some really understand the requirements before they get to that full in-depth partnering conversation. And so we can help there, and we can help every step along the way. So what I would encourage folks is you don't have to kind of bite off the full piece and do it in one go. This can be an iterative process where you can gather information over time to then inform the decisions that you're making and help shape the future, so that should you get to that partnering conversation at a later date, you're well positioned, you have been collecting the data that you need to as part of your clinical studies. So just encourage folks to kind of think about it early and think about it often.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with small biotechs as well, to add to that, you're oftentimes in that growth phase. So to really truly identify what kind of resources you need as you're expanding your team and as you're progressing in the pipeline, I think these perspectives from payers can really, payers and other stakeholders, right? If you're thinking ex-US, other key opinion leaders, I think can really help make more informed decisions. And even if you're not significantly changing your strategy, because oftentimes, even if a company is going into a pipeline development of an agent, they have a purpose behind it and they have a reasoning behind it. So even if you're not changing your strategy significantly, understanding what kind of access hurdles or challenges you may face or reimbursement hurdles you may face will just help you plan better. You'll be able to plan what your messaging should look like at every stage, what kind of resources you need. So I think it's even beyond just like completely changing your strategy. It's even about enhancing your strategy and making sure that you're prepared and setting realistic expectations within your company itself and with other stakeholders.
And we've got another question, which is, do you have examples of how firms outside of pharma manufacturers use payer perspectives in their strategy? Ritu, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we work with a variety of different companies, and I think like that's the beauty of the partnership between Evaluate and MMIT. Now, we are able to provide that end-to-end kind of pipeline to prescription access strategy, and you'll see that we work with financial firms when they're trying to make a decision, when they're conducting their due diligence to make a go no go decision on investing in an asset. We'll provide perspectives of what the forecast for that asset can look like, what does access for that particular asset would potentially look like. So we help financial firms make go no go decisions. Consulting firms, usually when they're supporting a client, these are natural questions that come up in different engagements. So oftentimes we'll provide data to back up what consultants are providing to their clients. But beyond that, Sean, any other examples that come to mind?
Now, one, it's just a continuation, I think, or two of your talking about the investors, but certainly folks on the sell side of these deals as well. So at the investment banks, working with companies who are acquiring other companies, providing them with a view into what access looks like, helps them manage that due diligence process. So if you think about the example that I mentioned earlier with Sprout, really understanding what access might look like can help these investment banks provide better guidance to their pharma customers or clients on whether or not to make an acquisition.
So I think we're getting towards the end of the hour, 30 minutes. So I'm just one final bit. It's my favourite bit. It's the called crystal ball gazing section, I call it. So what are some of the major market events we should be looking forward to based on, I suppose, the outlook from Evaluate and MMIT with your lens on the markets? I mean, maybe one example each, I don't know.
Yeah, I think biosimilars within immunology is definitely top of mind for all North Stella companies, I think, at this point, because it's going to be such a shift in how immunology has been operating so far. And we did see some of it when Inflectra and Remicade biosimilars came to market. But I think getting biosimilars for Enbrel and Humira, who have been standards of care so long, I think is going to be extremely exciting to look forward to. And I think, copay accumulators, maximizers, alternative methods of reimbursement with gene therapies, coming to market. What are the different alternate methods of contracting that may occur in the market, I think are going to be interesting things to look out for.
Sean, you've got 30 seconds roughly. Anything you want?
Right. I'll take a more macro view, and that's just what's going to happen with the market when it comes to funding in the near term and then long term. So we've all followed the challenges of the XBI over the last, call it 12 months. So what's going to happen there is funding certainly impacts a lot of the smaller companies that we're working with at Evaluate, and access to those funds is going to be critical for them as they look to advance these programs through the clinic and hopefully to the patient communities that desperately need them.
Yeah,
So
I
that's what
think
I'm keeping my eye on.
tighten up a little bit as we're going forward. So thank you both for what's been a very enlightening and sort of like, I think, a very interesting discussion. I think my key takeaways are the fact that companies need to start with the engagement process. It doesn't begin, it carries on all the way through the process. And the way that people engage might change during drug development. And yeah, so thank you very much for today. And remember, if we haven't answered your questions, then we will endeavour to get back to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Ritu.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Lisa.